Today we're going to be talking about the Alexander and Fox article entitled A Historical Perspective on Reading Research and Practice. And the nice thing about this article is it really walks us through reading research over the past several decades and breaks down for us the trends that have been popular at particular times and how the field has progressed since about the 1950s. So the first era that Alexander and Fox break the research into is this idea of the era of conditioned learning. And at that point, they were saying there was more of an interest in reading research because there were more kids in the classroom. There was a baby boom right after World War II, and all of a sudden they were seeing these students who were experiencing reading difficulties. So at this point, this is where phonics-based instruction was very popular. There was a very kind of the building blocks of language type of thing where they would start with the visual representations and go to the sounds, then go to the words and phrases and sentences. And it was really a behavioralist approach at that point. Now, in about the mid-1960s, they moved to this idea of the era of natural learning. And at that point, there was a little bit more attention being focused on this idea of the brain, the mental processes, and artificial intelligence was becoming really popular at this point, so that was really influencing the field. And they were starting to realize through research that language was developed through meaningful interactions. It wasn't just based on rote practice and just practicing these skills. There was something going on. There had to be some kind of meaningful relationship. So at that point, they thought that humans have some kind of template at birth, that they're able to understand language. So they were building on this idea is that, reading, the ability to read was innate. And there was a little bit of concern at this time coming out between differences they were seeing with children coming from low-income backgrounds and how that was matching up with the school-based types of experiences that they were expecting in school, but they didn't put a ton of focus on it at this point. This was when they really started talking about reading and writing being related to listening and speaking. Before that, it was pretty separated out, and the learner was active during this time. Now, as we moved into the era of information processing, at that point, there was a lot of interest in government-funded reading research, and actually I got my PhD from the University of Maryland, which was one of these government-funded reading research centers. And they brought together huge researchers from all types of literacy-related fields together into one place, thinking that if they had these great minds together, they would be able to make progress in understanding reading. And so we saw at this point a real increase in the number of cognitive psychologists that came into the field. And if you remember from our PowerPoint that we were talking about with the theories of reading, I said I myself was a cognitive psychologist. And that's because a lot of my background is based on what was coming out of the reading research centers during this time. Schema theory was huge during this point. We're talking mid-1970s to the mid-1980s. And this idea that it's not just the individual and what's going on mentally with the individual, it's also this idea that the group or the environment may play a role in what kids understand. As we kind of move forward into the next era, which was the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s, that was the era of sociocultural learning, and at this point there was a big focus on understanding about how students' diversity may impact their ability to read or comprehend differently, depending on what they're bringing to the classroom. And what they were finding is that, in the last era there was this focus on having kids, learn skills and strategies through direct instruction, but they found that that kind of instruction wasn't enough. There was something else going on that caused some students not to be picking up the strategies or not to be able to transfer those strategies to something else. So at this point, they really started to look at kids' sociocultural backgrounds, their SES, their race, learning differences, and see how those things affected students' understanding. They also looked at this idea of schooled versus unschooled language. So what do kids know versus from learning from school, and what are they learning from home and bringing into the classroom? And this was really the point where they were starting to look at like we said, social and contextual factors. But there was a lot of dissonance in the field as to how important each of these types of things are. And we're going to see that in a lot of the research we look at this semester, that although most researchers during this time and beyond realize that social and contextual factors are important, they value one or more of the others differently. The last bit was this idea of the era of engaged learning, and that's where they say we are now. I think we're kind of moving out of this. This was published in 2004, so we're about ready for a new era. But this is where they were starting to see that technology was requiring students to engage with text a bit differently. A lot of the text was nonlinear, which meant that there was no one way to read it. When you click hyperlinks and things like that, you go in different orders, which causes you to create different meanings. Because of that, at this time, by this time, a large field of motivational research had developed. So researchers were drawing on that, realizing that, hey, students' interest really has something to do with how they're able to understand a text. And there also became more interest in adolescent and adult literacy at this point. Up until then, we really focused on beginning and struggling readers. After this, we looked a bit differently. And so at this point, what we're looking at is that it's common knowledge, or a common belief, that cognitive, social, and motivational factors all play a role in students' abilities to read, and that technology has changed the way we're learning and how we're teaching. So what we're looking at now is this idea of, what have we learned from the last 50 years? And I think that it's important for us to look at the fact that the reading field has really changed a lot. Who makes up the reading community changes a lot over time. It's not this static belief that's kind of like there's one right way to think about it. At different periods of time, different groups of researchers have kind of come to the forefront as the leaders in the field. We see that the trends in reading research tend to reflect what's going on in political fields, and that's why with this era of engaged learning, they were seeing a lot of influence from things like No Child Left Behind and the testing, and so we're going to continue to see that. And so as we're thinking about what trends we might expect in the future, we might think about what are some of the important political aspects that are going on right now in schools. We also keep revisiting similar topics, but as we learn more about the topics or have a different view, we go back and revisit them. Right now, a lot of the research I'm doing, although it deals with technology, which is very current, it goes back and looks at a lot of the issues we were talking about with schema and text-based knowledge, which was more prevalent in the 1970s and early 1980s. So you're going to see these cycles come back around as we go through. And we're always going to have rival camps in reading. Right now we kind of have different groups, people who believe more of a top-down approach, some that believe more of a bottom-up approach, other people believe more in a balance, and we'll find our way to some kind of conclusion. But I think that type of rivalry actually makes our field better because it pushes us to be able to explain why we're doing what we're doing, not just assume it as fact. You'll see at the bottom of my handout, I have some sample questions for you. We are not answering them today in class, but those are examples of the types of questions you will post when you put your article up on D2L. So you'll take those questions and put them in separate posts on D2L, and I'll have them labeled for you so you'll know where to put your question.